today we're looking at the war in Russia. Hitler turns east, and we're going to be examining, of course, the reasons why he makes that decision, what he's hoping to accomplish. In the unit, we'll see how the Wehrmacht is actually stopped before Moscow, and then how they attempt another great push the next year in 1942, and how they're stopped at Stalingrad. So we're going to go ahead and examine these things. Now, before we actually discuss Germany and what Hitler is doing, I want to take a few minutes and discuss exactly how the Soviet Union, what it looked like by the eve of Operation Barbarossa here. Specifically, what is Stalin doing in the Soviet Union? Now, Stalin had been a very useful lieutenant to Lenin, and Lenin, of course, passes away in 1924. He has a series of strokes, and he dies in 1924. And Stalin had actually served in different capacities. He had been what Lenin called the Commissar of Nationalities. And what that meant is the Soviet Union, though it was not yet called the Soviet Union for a little while, it boasts many different languages and peoples, nationalities. And so, like, Stalin was kind of charged in theory with kind of helping them to integrate into the Soviet Union and still kind of promoting their own cultures and whatnot. And the reality is, his job is to kind of bring them all in line, to forcibly integrate them into Soviet society. And he also had another title here, and his title was General Secretary. General Secretary. Now that term, General Secretary, it's kind of like Minister without portfolio, meaning he held a secretariat, but again, there's no real specific brief. He just kind of holds cabinet rank, but he was kind of like Lenin's troubleshooter. And it's going to be interesting because what's going to happen is, in the communist world, in the Soviet Union, and then later in, like, China, that party position, General Secretary, will mean de facto leader of the state. That is not how it is initially intended. It just means minister without portfolio. But because Stalin becomes the most powerful man in the state, General Secretary comes to mean the leader, right? So that's what it eventually comes to mean here. Some people have described the relationship of Stalin to Lenin at this time as that of Martin Bormann to Hitler. And we haven't really talked a lot about Martin Bormann, but he was Hitler's secretary, personal secretary. But he just kind of made himself indispensable to Hitler in the way that Stalin makes himself indispensable to Lenin. We'll talk more about Bormann somewhat later. Lenin is only 53 when he dies. He'd actually been shot. A woman had actually shot Lenin, and he recovered enough to go back to work, but he never fully recovers, and then that kind of brings on, like I said, these series of strokes that ultimately kill him. Now, Stalin, he essentially is able to, after Lenin dies, Stalin is able to kind of maneuver himself into a position of power by making political alliances with other prominent Bolsheviks, specifically Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin. They all kind of come together, and the reason they come together is, of course, Stalin's great rival here. I don't have him up there. Stalin's great rival is a guy by the name of Lev Trotsky, or Leon Trotsky. And Trotsky, a lot of people thought when the revolution happened that if ever it was to devolve into like a one-man dictatorship, Trotsky would be the dictator. Trotsky was the head of the Red Army. He's the guy that negotiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 that ended World War I, or brought Russia out of World War I. So everybody's expecting Trotsky. Everybody's kind of scared of Trotsky's because they think Trotsky is going to be the Napoleon of the revolution, right? So they actually, a bunch of other Bolsheviks, these guys, get together with Stalin, essentially to oppose Trotsky. What they do is they actually force Trotsky to go into exile. They force him to go into exile. All these other guys think that we don't like Stalin. In fact, when Stalin died, Lenin, specifically in his will and political testament, said Stalin can never rule the Soviet Union because he was, quote, too rude. too rude. He's too rude to rule. So, I mean, people, they kind of look down on Stalin a little bit. He's the guy that gets his hands dirty, where they see themselves as these great intellectuals. And Stalin's the guy who puts bullets in backs of people's heads, right? But what happens is, Stalin is given a position where he is essentially in charge of the party bureaucracy. The party bureaucracy. And while he's in charge of the party bureaucracy, he essentially puts people into positions of power that are personally loyal to him. He puts people in positions of power that are personally loyal to him. And so, after Trotsky is expelled in about 1927. So, kind of the need for this group, this counterweight to Trotsky, after 1927, it's not that important. And all these other party leaders, they begin to realize Stalin has tremendous power within the party because all these people are loyal to him. And many people are forced to admit, yes, they had made mistakes by opposing Stalin in the past, but they wouldn't do so again. They kind of have to show contrition for their political opposition to Stalin in the past. But by 1928, Stalin announces, we've got to get rid of the NEP. Does everybody remember what the NEP was when we talked about the NEP? The New Economic Plan, the New Economic Policy. What was it? What was the New Economic Policy? What did it do? You remember? Yeah, it allowed for limited free markets, state capitalism. Essentially, people could buy and sell and trade things. You could have the net men who would go to the farms. They would buy the grain, and they would go to the cities. They'd sell it at a profit, right? So that's what the NEP was. Well, by 1928, Stalin says, no, it's time to get rid of the NEP. It's done its job. So he gets rid of the NEP. He calls anybody that still likes the NEP right deviationists. Remember when they brought in the NEP, anybody that opposed the NEP was a left deviationist. They were going too far to the left. Now he's saying anybody that's for the NEP is going too far to the right. And instead, he introduces something called the FiveYear Plan. The FiveYear Plan. Now, the FiveYear Plan is a much more dogmatic Marxist attitude. So markets are gone. Everything, consumer goods, everything that people want will be given to them by the state. The state controls everything. So no more net men, no more markets. The plan was that in 5 years, the Soviet Union would be completely industrialized. The plan was to completely industrialize the Soviet Union in just 5 years. That's why it's called the FiveYear Plan. There's supposed to be a 5-year plan, where then we're fully industrialized and Marxism will be kind of more easily attained, right? In fact, they never, after they finish the 5-year plan and they haven't fully industrialized, they say, well, now we need another 5-year plan. So there was originally supposed to be one 5-year plan, but eventually what happens is this is the economic model that the Soviet Union adopts. It becomes permanent. In fact, when the Soviet Union falls in 1989, they were on their 13th 5-year plan. Okay, they're on their 13th 5-year plan. One of the ways they motivate people here to work is there was a guy named Stakhanov. And Stakhanov, I can't remember his first name, he was a miner. And under very specifically prepared conditions, Alexei Stakhanov, under very specific prepared conditions, he was a coal miner, he produced 102 tons of coal in 6 hours. 102 tons of coal in 6 hours. Okay? Now, if that sounds like a lot, it is, because as I say, he actually had a team working with him that was doing it. But in the press, they say it was this one guy was doing it. This one guy was producing all this coal. And so Stakhanov became an instant celebrity, and they adopt this term Stakhanovism. Work! Look at what this guy did. He produced 102 tons of coal. This guy's everything that's great about the Soviet Union. He works. And of course, you could get some rewards, some modest rewards for this. 102 tons of coal, incidentally, in a 6-hour shift was 14 times the average. It was 14 times what an average 6-hour shift produced. Very quickly, you have other people set even greater records, but the name Stakhanovism sticks by this point. So he becomes this kind of symbol of the way you should produce. And I say you get some rewards. They're pretty modest rewards. You don't get raises, per se. You get a little bit more rations, maybe briefly, for like a week or two. You get maybe 2 hams instead of 1, you know. When most people don't get hams, right? There are 2 things the Soviets do that are positive when they come to power. Number 1 is they actually do bring electricity to rural areas. It's a major program, and they actually end up bringing electricity to rural areas. Second thing is literacy rates increase pretty drastically under the Soviet Union. More and more people are taught how to read. They believe strongly in education. Of course, all they're reading is Marxism, crap like that, but they are reading, right? 2 of the few good things the Soviets did there. But now, Stalin's desire to see the Soviet Union industrialized stems from the fact that he believes sooner or later the West, the capitalist West, is going to invade the Soviet Union and try to destroy communism. And if the Soviet Union is going to prevent that, it too has to industrialize. It too has to have an industrial base that can build modern weapons of war with which the Soviets can defend themselves. Now, this is not an entirely paranoid idea. In 1918, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Japan had all invaded the Soviet Union. They had all briefly invaded the Soviet Union to help white Russians fight in their civil war. So if you were to ask Stalin when the Cold War began, he would say 1918. He wouldn't say 1945, 1946, he'd say 1918. So Stalin very much wants to westernize, or not westernize, but industrialize the Soviet Union so it can protect itself from what he believes will be an inevitable Soviet or a Western attack on the Soviet Union. Now, the problem is with all this industrialization, because they're building tons of new stuff. In fact, they see about, in this first 5-year plan, I think about 1,500 new industrial plants, coal plants, are produced at this time, as well as the electricity in the countryside really starts to spread at this time. But the human costs in order to achieve this is staggering. Now, I don't recall if I mentioned in this class, but most nations, when they industrialize, generally take about 30 to 40 years. The process of industrialization is usually 30 to 40 years. The very first nation on earth to industrialize was Great Britain. It begins the process in 1780. By 1820, we can say Britain has a fully industrialized economy. The United States and Germany are the next 2 countries to industrialize. They really begin the process in earnest in the 1860s. By 1900, you can say America and Germany have fully industrialized, okay? The Soviet Union will industrialize in just 10 years. They will do it in just 10 years. And they do it in 10 years because they don't care about the human cost. They force-feed the machine. Soviet terror is absolutely necessary to do this. You have the NKVD, which is the Soviet, is the successor to the Cheka, right? We talked about the Cheka, which was the secret police. By the 30s, you have the NKVD, which is the successor organization. It's like Ministry of the Interior. That will in turn be succeeded later by the KGB. But the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, they are kind of in charge of this whole process. They run the gulags. The gulags are the Soviet concentration camps, the Soviet labor camps, okay? And essentially, they are arresting people whenever they need to fill quotas of labor, and they need more people in the camps to run these camps. They would just arrest people on the flimsiest of pretexts. If you were 5 minutes late to work, you could be deemed a saboteur and arrested and sent to a camp. There's a thing once about this army tank driver. He got his tank stuck in the mud. They labeled him a saboteur, and he went to a gulag for 5 years, right? And these gulags are just absolutely horrible, horrible places where they throw people who are not even by any stretch of the imagination criminals in with these hardened murderers and rapists and thieves. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his Gulag Archipelago, if you get a chance, read it. It's a very good book. He talks about being in one of these camps. He says, heaven help you if you were a halfway attractive woman. You were just you would be treated absolutely horribly in one of these camps. There was one instance where they had a ship, and in one side of the cargo hold they were using it as kind of a temporary prison. One side of the cargo hold where they were keeping the men, the other side they were keeping the women. The men find out they got the women in the other side. They actually, through a steel wall, they kept pounding on it for a long time, and I don't know what they used. They actually punched a hole through the wall. They got into the women, just raped, killed many of these women, while the guards were just looking on. They didn't do anything. And very often, too, in a lot of these camps, these guards were the worst offenders here against people. And as you can imagine, like any prison, it's not just women that are being raped, men are being raped, men are being worked to death, starved to death in these things. And it's these criminals, these actual criminals, who are running these camps, and the guards let them. And they're preying upon these innocent people, essentially, in these camps. One of the things they do is they dig a canal between the White Sea to the Baltic Sea. This canal was dug almost entirely by hand. Okay, a canal was dug almost entirely by hand. 100,000 people die building the White Sea to the Baltic Sea canal. 100,000 people die, and it's of marginal economic value. But 100,000 people died building that canal. And just to put this into a frame of reference for you, in 1939, the year World War II begins, there were 20,000 people in German concentration camps. Okay, 20,000 people in German concentration camps. There were over 1 million people in Soviet gulags at this time. Okay. Now, we talked about the kulaks. Who are the kulaks? Who are the kulaks? Farmers who had it just a little bit better off than everybody else. Farmers that had just a little bit better off than everybody else. Okay? Farmers, these are people that instead of 1 cow, they have 2 cows. They have enough land, they have so much land, that family can't farm it, so they hire other people to come and help them work on their land. The Soviets, because remember, Marxism is all about the city and industrial life and industrial proletariat. This is the way that the Soviets, when they actually come to power in Russia, kind of export class warfare from the cities to the countryside. They find kulaks, people that are just a little bit better off. And they're better off, guess what? Because more often than not, they've worked hard. Farming is a hard thing to do. It's a hard life. These people are generally pretty smart. I'm sure some people inherited stuff and got lucky. I'm sure that happened. But in this time, that doesn't explain the vast majority of these people. It's people that work hard, they've been smart with their money, and that's why they're better off. And they're being punished for being successful. They're being punished for being successful. And to this point, they're not just being punished for being successful. They are, it's not just like they're getting fined or anything. They are literally being pulled off their farms, the bullets are back of their heads, or they go to gulags. They're supposed to, the people that are producing, the people that are doing more are punished, right? Sent to camps, bullets in the backs of their heads. But then also, you have this drive for what they called collectivization, meaning very often they would confiscate outright farms, and then they would also go to some people and they would pressure them and scare them, threaten them to collectivize, people that own their own farms, to the point where virtually everybody has to collectivize. You don't have anybody hold out for long in the 1930s with their own farm. What collectivization is, according to Soviet doctrine, if we take everybody's farm and we put it together and make one big farm, and then everybody just works on this one big farm, and we bring all of the produce to a central area where it can be, we can keep records on it and decide what to do with it, we will produce more, right? Because people want everybody to succeed, everybody's going to work together, everybody's going to be happy, why not? Right? It completely discounts human nature, right? The most powerful motivating force is your own interests. I'm not going to go out and work, 12-hour days so that, he's got something. I might work 12-hour days so that I can get ahead, but I'm not going to do it for the other guy, right? It completely is counter to human interest, right? And the greatest of all self-interests, arguably, is your kids. You want to leave something for your kids. You want to create something for your kids, right? So collectivization actually turns out to be, no surprise, a complete and total failure. And these collective farms, very often the state would buy a tractor for the collective farm. Well, everybody would go out and use the tractor, but guess what? When the tractor breaks down, it's somebody else's problem. Now, if I own that tractor and it's my land, well, shoot, I got to fix that tractor. But if the state, so they would write letters to the state, hey, we got a tractor, our production's down. The state says, well, this is your quota, you got to meet it. Well, our tractor's down. So these things don't work, okay? Collectivization does not work. And yet the Soviets are going to double down on it. They're going to double down on it because it gives them control. It gives the Soviets control. They can say what happens with that product. And one of the greatest farming regions on Earth, one of the greatest places on Earth to farm, is Ukraine. And all these Ukrainian farmers, and the Soviets, the Russian Soviets, there was a real chauvinism toward the Ukrainians. They saw Ukrainians as kind of their idiot cousins, right? They really looked down on Ukrainians. Not much has changed in over 100 years. Stalin decides the only real way to pay for all that industrialization, the only real way to pay to make all of these like power plants and stuff we're going to need, the only thing we have to sell, we Soviets have to sell abroad in the world market to make money, is food. Because we can grow a lot of food, we can sell that food abroad, we can make money, we can industrialize. So what they do is they essentially go to Ukraine and they order all the food essentially to be taken out of Ukraine, very, very little left for people in Ukraine to actually use, to actually have. And everybody's too scared to tell Stalin this isn't working, even though he probably knew it. And at one point they actually passed laws in Ukraine saying you cannot have any food at all in your house. All the food has to go to these central places where then in theory you could go, you could eat there, and that's where you would get your food. But the reality is you go to these central places and they got nothing. So people are trying to save a little something for themselves and their family, and then, of course, the Soviet commissars show up, they see you've got food there, they take it, and you might just get a bullet in the back of the head. Okay? You cannot, you're called a food hoarder. If you have just a little bit of food in your house, you were called a hoarder. And it's because Stalin wants more money. The more grain he can sell, the more money he makes on the foreign market, right? And he's not too worried about long-term issues here. He thinks that it'll all sort itself out, but in the short term, he needs as much grain, as much food as he can. And some people were aware of this. There were people throughout Russia that were saying, do we really need to starve the countryside to feed the cities, you know? And whenever people would bring that to Stalin's attention, he'd just, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. And Stalin was not averse to having big, giant feasts himself. But what this leads to, what these policies lead to, is essentially an entirely avoidable man-made famine in the Ukraine, an entirely avoidable man-made famine in the Ukraine, and we call this the Holodomor. The Holodomor. Okay? The Holodomor. In fact, if you go to Washington, D.C., they've got a monument to the Holodomor in Washington, D.C. This is kind of comparable, in a sense, to the German Holocaust. Now, obviously, there's a lot of differences. Targets are different, the numbers are different, but I mean, it's this kind of idea of state terror against one segment of society. There's actually, I read Timothy Snyder wrote a great book called Bloodlands. And he tells a story in this book. He says there were these, did I tell this one about the nuns? And they're taking the children? I don't think I told in this class. There are these nuns, and they're taking these children around Ukraine looking for food. They ran an orphanage. They ran out of food, so they're taking these children with them on these big walks to try to find food. And at one point, they go from town to town begging, essentially. And of course, the towns didn't have any food. And at one point, these kids look like a skeleton here. This kid's a skeleton. At one point, they go to they were walking between villages, and one of the nuns realized that a bunch of the boys were missing. So she goes back, and she finds 2 or 3 bigger boys holding down the smaller boy, and they were literally tearing strips of flesh off of him to eat. And this kid that was having this flesh torn was then picking his own flesh and eating. There's just no food. and cannibalism occurred. I mean, this is hell on earth, and it's entirely avoidable. It's from decisions from evil men trying to exert power because they can, right? Scary stuff. As I mentioned, the people that oppose this, they're labeled right deviationists. Right deviationists. I believe I mentioned when we talked about the Cheka and stuff like that, Heinrich Himmler pretty much models the SS and the German police force on the Soviet police force, on the way the Soviets are doing things. The German concentration camps, to a large extent, are modeled on the Soviet gulags. These are the ideas about it, right? This is what's going on in the Soviet Union. But we also have something else very important. And that is known as the Great Purge. Now, there were many leaders in the Red Army. Many leaders of the Red Army. And Stalin knows, kind of the way Hitler had the Night of the Long Knives, which is kind of his purge. And Hitler knew that the army could oppose him. Stalin, too, in Russia, knows that the Red Army can oppose him. So instead of trying to do something to win their loyalty, he just kills most of them, or a good number of them, right? So what Stalin does is he begins to initiate purges against Red Army officers. Now, not only Red Army officers, he's actually going after a lot of his political opponents. In fact, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, those guys, they all have trials. They're all put on trials here in the mid-30s for being spies and saboteurs, and these big show trials where everyone can see. They're essentially tortured into admitting what they did was wrong. Sometimes they'll say, you either admit what you did was wrong or we'll kill your family, kind of a thing. So these people confess their crimes and they get a bullet in the back of the head. But the Red Army here is probably the deepest impact of these purges. You have, during the purges here, about 33,000 officers are relieved of command. Relieved of command, which means many of them go to camps. Some of them will just get crap jobs. The 33,000 are relieved of command. Of those, about 7,000 of them were arrested. About 7,000 of them were arrested. Many of them were shot. Some of them, as I say, go to camps. You had at this time 67 Army Corps. An Army Corps is a military unit, about 2 to 4 divisions roughly. There was about 67 Army Corps in Russia. Virtually every leader of an Army Corps is relieved of his command at this time. But also, at the highest levels, you also have changes. So right here, these 5 men were marshals of the Soviet Union. That's the highest rank in the Red Army you could attain, Marshal of the Soviet Union. This guy here, his name is Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Mikhail Tukhachevsky. He is really an innovator. He is thinking the same way Heinz Guderian is thinking in Germany about how to use tanks. Essentially a Soviet version of blitzkrieg. They called it deep operations. Deep operations. This guy is probably the smartest guy the Soviets have when it comes to military thinking. But he ran afoul of Stalin in 1920. I won't get into it, but they didn't like each other very much. And what happens is, during the purge, 3 out of these 5 marshals will be shot, including Tukhachevsky. 3 of these 5 marshals will be shot. Voroshilov here and Budeny, they survive. And Voroshilov survives because he's essentially Stalin's crony. Voroshilov is kind of like the Soviet Wilhelm Keitel in OKW in Germany. Okay, so Voroshilov's a real piece of crap. But anyway, they're the only ones that survive. Now, what this means is the Soviet Union is losing some of their very best officers right on the eve of Hitler invading. Okay, these purges begin about 1936, 1937, and they last really in earnest until 1941. I mean, it'll kind of slow down before that, but it'll kind of continue. Now, Hitler sees this. Hitler sees what's going on in the Soviet Union, and he says, look at them. Look at it's rot. They're tearing themselves apart. Hitler's going to use that to help justify his move here. So Hitler begins to prepare to plan for war here. But here's the thing. You know, there's that old saying that people that are trading partners don't go to war. But Germany and Russia are trading tremendous amounts. They're each other's biggest trading partners since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. Germany is just getting a flood of food, of metals, of oil from the Soviet Union. It's getting just a ton of materials from the Soviet Union. Germany, they're also getting things like cotton, various metals. The cotton, the Soviets weren't growing cotton. They were actually buying cotton from like China. And then they're sending it to Germany. And that's the way of getting around the blockade, the British blockade. But over the course of the pact, the USSR sent Germany 26,000 tons of chrome, 140,000 tons of manganese, and 2 million tons of oil. 2 million tons of oil. Now, in exchange, this is all stuff the Germans can use right now. It's all stuff that they can put to immediate use in Germany. What Germany is giving the Soviets in turn is technology. Blueprints for building factories, for battleships, for other industrial projects. So Germany is getting immediate benefits. Russia, the Soviet Union, is getting long-term benefits. Okay? In theory. Now, in 1940, Ribbentrop was seriously trying to get the Soviet Union to enter the war on Germany's side. In 1940, Ribbentrop is actually negotiating with Molotov and trying to bring the Soviet Union into the war, but the Soviets keep refusing. Soviets kind of like being neutral. They like seeing the West. Stalin was actually disappointed because he wanted to see the battle in France go on like it did in World War I. He was really upset that France fell as quickly as it did. And also, too, they have a lot of conflicting interests in the Balkans. They have conflicting interests in the Balkans. Romania, Bulgaria, they both want more influence there. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Soviets invaded Finland. The Soviets invaded Finland. Hitler was not happy about that. In fact, Mussolini was already sending stuff to help the Finns against the Soviets, right? So Hitler was not happy about that move. But Hitler always saw the accommodation with the Soviet Union as a temporary truce rather than a permanent peace. Okay? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a temporary truce and not a permanent peace. Because Hitler's worldview, as we know, is he believes that both capitalism and communism are simply Jewish tools to rule the world. Capitalism and communism are Jewish tools to rule the world and to degrade the Aryan race. This never changes. Hitler holds this opinion right to the end of his life. So by the fall of 1940, no doubt brought on by the failure of Germany to take over England, Hitler believes that it's time for the final showdown. It is finally time to knock out the Soviet Union. So he orders his generals to prepare for a plan to move against the Soviets. You know, it's interesting, too, in 1940, Molotov actually visited Berlin, and they're kind of discussing stuff with Ribbentrop. And Ribbentrop's really trying to get the Soviets to enter the war. And the whole time Ribbentrop's saying, well, we're going to win. Victory's just around the corner. Britain can't win on its own. Victory's around the corner. And the British launched an air raid on Berlin, so they all had to go down to an air raid shelter. So they're in this air raid shelter. British bombs are bombing the capital, and Ribbentrop's saying this, we're going to win, we're going to win. And Molotov just says, then why are we in an air raid shelter? If you're winning the war, why are we in an air raid shelter? On March 30th, 1941, he briefs his generals about this upcoming war against the Soviet Union. He said, quote, "This is a war of extermination. Commanders must be prepared to sacrifice their personal scruples." he told them that famine would be their ally. Famine would be their ally. They would attempt to take all the food to prevent any Soviets from providing resistance. He expected about 30 million Soviet troops to die from starvation. Soviet people, rather, to die from starvation. 30 million Soviet people to die from starvation. He said the very few Slavs that remained would be slaves to future German settlers. Waves of German settlers would move into Russia, and the Slavs would be their slaves. In fact, Hitler compared the German occupation of Russia, as he saw it, to the British occupation of India. Now, in India, you had about 40,000 British bureaucrats running this huge part of the Asian subcontinent. Millions of people, with just 40,000 British administrators. He said, we can do the same thing in Russia. We'll have all these German administrators, German settlers, and then the indigenous people, like I say, they'll be slaves. He said, we'll teach them just enough so that they can read our signposts and not get hit by cars. This is the essence of Lebensraum. Lebensraum, living room. Yeah, let's see here. So Hitler says, quote, the German colonist ought to live on handsome, spacious farms. The German services will be lodged in marvelous buildings, the governors in palaces. Around the city, to a depth of 30 to 40 kilometers, we shall have a belt of handsome villages connected by the best roads. What exists beyond that will be another world, in which we mean to let the Russians live as they like. It is merely necessary that we should rule them. In the event of revolution, we shall only have to drop a few bombs on their cities, and the affair will be liquidated. He predicted that the Germans, he thought, once we take over Russia, you will have people of German blood in America and South America, all over the world. People that had German blood, they would come back to Europe to settle in Russia. They essentially encouraged them by giving them free land or discounted land in Russia. He said that by the 1960s, there would be 20 million German colonists in Russia. 20 million German colonists in Russia. In 100 years, our language will be the language of Europe. In 100 years, our language will be the language of Europe. Okay, so a couple of things. The Germans are brilliant at operations, meaning actually launching attacks and winning attacks, outmaneuvering your enemy. They're brilliant at it. The Germans are brilliant when it comes to operations. But they're not very good when it comes to some other things. As we'll see, they're not very good at intelligence. They're not very good at figuring out what the enemy's going to do. They're not very good at that. And they're not very good at logistics. They're not good at logistics. Logistics is, how do you keep your armies supplied? How do you keep them have food, water, ammunition? And in a mechanized war like this, if you have a tank, if just one small part of that tank breaks down, the whole thing's broken. So you have to have all sorts of tank parts. You have to have your radios for the tanks. You have to have, the gunnery stuff, the turret stuff, the tread stuff. You have to have all of this stuff constantly flowing to the front to make repairs. Otherwise, the tank is useless, right? Germans are not good at this sort of thing. They're not good at it. The plan calls for 3 large army groups to invade Russia, which would consist of about 3.8 million men. 3.8 million men. These men would have to be fed and provisioned. Food would be required not just for the men, but they're sending in armies of horses. Armies of horses. These things are going to have to be fed too. All those parts to keep tanks and artillery and aircraft moving, all that stuff's got to go up there. The big consideration, though, is food. How do you keep your army fed? If we're sending trucks filled with parts, there's not enough room for food. So this is where Hitler's racism, his anti-Slavic bent, meshes with the practical needs of the army to keep the army moving, keep it fed. And that is essentially says, we're not going to feed the army. We're not going to keep food moving up in front. Rather, the army will have to feed itself. The army will steal from every farm they can find. It will provision itself. And this is fine because, of course, you're just stealing from Slavs. You're just stealing from people who, frankly, are not going to do... people who are not worth the effort of keeping alive, right? Slavs, inferior peoples. And they're communists. Further, they're communists. You're stealing from communists. So Hitler's, like I say, his desire to keep his army fed, it meshes with his racism, and it meshes with his anti-communism. It all comes together. So the army is told to live off the land. And this effectively sentences the Soviet peoples to this terror of murder and violence on an unprecedented scale. Now, the German army was expected to launch Operation Barbarossa in early May. This would give them the whole summer. This was close enough to the summer that the roads, the muds, would not be an issue, and you'd have the whole summer to knock out Russia. That was the plan. And they think they can do it. They think they can knock out Russia. I mean, after all, Germany beat the Russians in World War I, right? Russia pulled out of World War I. And the Germans didn't even have Panzer Divisions in World War I. They got Panzer Divisions now. The Soviet army was considered vastly inferior to the French army, and the French army folded in 6 weeks. So everybody's expecting Russia to just be a walkover. A walkover. Hitler said all we have to do is kick open the front door and the whole edifice will fall down. But something happens that derails Hitler's plans. And that is Mussolini gets a little greedy here. Mussolini, actually down here in Greece, the Italians controlled Albania. Mussolini, without informing Hitler, invades Greece. He invades Greece. And the Greeks defend themselves. The Greeks are able to push the Italians back across the border and into Albania. So Hitler decides he's going to send his army there, but he can't transport everything to Albania. He doesn't have the shipping and the logistical ability, so he has to go through Yugoslavia. He has to go through Yugoslavia. Now, initially, Yugoslavia said, yes, you can move your troops through, that'll be fine. And then there's a coup. There's a pro-Allies coup in Yugoslavia. They remove the government, so Hitler is forced to invade Yugoslavia. He invades Yugoslavia. He takes over Yugoslavia, and it's funny because, Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, a couple of guys on motorcycles, German officers on motorcycles, they ride into the middle of Yugoslavia. They find to Belgrade, and these officers say, "Oh, hey, we're here under a flag of truce." They just bumped into it like a bunch of Yugoslav army. They just kind of bump into these guys and say, "Hey, we're here under a flag of truce. One phone call from me, and this town is destroyed. We've got air units. We're here as a courtesy." So these units of Belgrade surrender. It's a total bluff. It's a total bluff. They didn't. Yeah, these guys were just out on their own, but they were so scared of what the Germans could do here. So then, of course, there's a little island off of Greece down here called Crete. And the British are using it. The British actually sent units to fight in here. They pull back onto Crete. And the British, or the Germans want to take Crete, but they've got no navy in the Eastern Mediterranean with which to invade Crete. So how do they do it? They drop paratroopers. They succeed. They take the island of Crete, but they take just horrific losses, absolutely horrific losses. And you never have any major airborne operations. The Germans never conduct any major airborne operations after that. Any questions? This will push back the launch date of Barbarossa about 6 weeks. Okay, as we'll see, it will launch on June 20th. But this costs the Wehrmacht several weeks, okay? Now, here's the thing. By 1941, Rudolf Hess, party member Hess, essentially the head of the party at this point, number 3 in line of succession, Hess is increasingly feeling marginalized. Because Hitler doesn't really care about the party anymore. Now that the war's going, he's like, the party will take care of itself, right? He's much more interested in the war and not in the party. So whenever Hess tries to get in to see Hitler, he can't. Martin Bormann, whom I mentioned a little while ago, Hitler's secretary, he had actually worked for Hess. He'd been Hess's subordinate, and then he goes to work for Hitler. And now Bormann is telling Hess, "Oh, the Führer can't see you. The Führer can't see you." Right? So Hess increasingly feels sidelined. So he comes up with this crazy scheme here in May of 1941. Hess was, among other things, a pilot. And Hess takes a specially modified long-range Bf-110 fighter, and he flies it out of Germany, and he crash lands in a field in Scotland. And actually, he bails out. He actually bails out over Scotland. The plane crashes. His plan was, during the 1936 Olympics, he had met the Duke of Hamilton. The Duke of Hamilton. He meets the Duke of Hamilton, or he had met the Duke of Hamilton in 1936, and he says, when a farmer finds him, and he actually tells the farmer his name's Alfred Horn. And then after a few hours, he admits he's Rudolf Hess. The police come, and he says, "I need to speak to the Duke of Hamilton. I'm here on a peace mission." He believed that he could work out a peace deal with the British and neutralize the war against Britain on the eve of the invasion of the Soviet Union. He knows all about the invasion of the Soviet Union. So this is a potentially damaging intelligence thing for Hitler here. Well, he will remain a prisoner for the rest of the war. The British never take him seriously. In fact, Winston Churchill was watching a Marx Brothers movie, and they came into the middle of it and they said, "Rudolf Hess just landed in Scotland." And he said, "I'm going to finish my movie." So he finished the movie, and then they find out about it. Churchill doesn't want to talk to him. He doesn't care anything he has to say. So Hess remains a prisoner of the British, and he will feign madness and he'll feign amnesia. By Nuremberg, he'll say, "I can't remember anything that happened." But this is a potentially very big problem for Hitler, because he doesn't want Hess telling the British all of his plans, and the British then communicating it to the Soviets. And in fact, Hitler then relieves Hess of all of his party offices, and he essentially makes Martin Bormann the head of the party. Now, the British are passing on as much information to the Soviets as they can. They think, hey, Germany is going to invade the Soviet Union. Germany is going to invade the Soviet Union. And the Soviet intelligence services say there's a big buildup in Poland, military buildup in Poland. We think the Germans are going to invade. You actually have deserters. German deserters actually cross the lines to the Soviets, and they tell them, "We have orders to invade." Richard Sorge is a German, and he's a journalist living in Japan. Okay? So he's a German journalist living in Japan. But he hobnobs with a lot of high Japanese officials, and some of these Japanese officials either have some kind of knowledge or Japanese intelligence is deduced, so they found out the Germans are going to invade Russia. He learns all about this, and he passes all this information on to Stalin. He's a communist. He's a secret communist. Anybody who's a communist in Germany this time, of course, is a secret communist, right? So Stalin has all of these various intelligence sources telling him Hitler is going to invade. Hitler is going to invade. And Stalin says, "Nah, I trust Hitler." The one guy he shouldn't have trusted, Stalin didn't trust anybody except the one guy he shouldn't have trusted, right? And so he does not believe that Hitler is going to invade. June 22nd, 1941, just after 3 a.m., the German army and its Axis allies begin the attack on Russia. This is Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa. What does Barbarossa mean? It was named after the 13th century Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. It's named after him. He went to fight in the East in the Crusades. He didn't make it. He died in Turkey. but he went east to fight in the Crusade, so that's why they're saying. And then there was a legend that Barbarossa's body was brought back to the mountains of Germany, and if ever Germany was in its greatest peril, he would rise from the grave to help Germany. But anyway, so they launch Operation Barbarossa here in June of 41. Hitler has his headquarters now in East Prussia, a place called Rastenburg, East Prussia. He codenames it the Wolf's Lair. And Hitler tells his generals, quote, again, we have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will come crashing down. He also said, before 3 months have passed, we shall witness the collapse of Russia, the like of which has never been seen in history. Hitler goes on the radio and he states that he did not want war with the Soviet Union, but he reluctantly had to do it because the Soviets were planning on attacking us. So it's kind of the same logic he used during the Rom purge, or during the Rom purge, right? Land of the Long Knives, when he said, I had to do it because Rom was going to have a revolution against me, so we had to move first, right? It's the same thing here. He says the Soviets were going to invade, so we had to invade them first. Goebbels reads a statement over the radio. He said, quote, at this moment a march is taking place, for its extent compares with the greatest the world has ever seen. I have decided today to place the fate and future of the Reich and our people in the hands of our soldiers. May God aid us, especially in this fight. And Goebbels will call this the European Crusade against Bolshevism. The European Crusade against Bolshevism. Because it's not just the Germans. They've got Italian units, they've got Hungarian units, Romanian units, they have got Spanish units that are volunteers there that are fighting. Eventually, you'll have French that will fight there. You'll even have about 30 English prisoners of war that will fight against the Russians. Hitler, but also his party leaders, his military leaders, all these guys believe they can do this. They can take out the Soviet Union. Okay? They can do it. And again, all these factors come into play. Like I say, they didn't have Panzer Divisions and they'd won in World War I. Stalin had just purged all his officers. Right? So all these things come into play. He thinks he can do it. And the operation meets with initial stunning success. We have the... so this is actually a thing from... kind of showing you roughly in terms of the United States, the geographic territory that's captured over the course of the summer here. So that you can see all these American states, roughly, that's how much territory was captured at this time. So you have three army groups. Army Group North, which is headed toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, which is headed toward Moscow. And Army Group South, which is headed toward Kiev. Now, in each of these army groups, it is the Panzer Divisions that are the tips of the spear. The tips of the spear, the Panzer Divisions, right? They're out front. They're the ones that are moving. They're bypassing strong points. They're driving deeper and deeper into Russia. But the bulk of the German army is moving into Russia the same way their fathers had, 20 years earlier, 30 years earlier. That is to say, on horses. Most of them are marching and moving on horses. The bulk of the German army is not mechanized. In 5 days, Army Group North drives 155 miles through Lithuania and into Latvia. 5 days, the Army Group North drives 155 miles through Lithuania and into Latvia. By July 10th, Army Group North was 80 miles from Leningrad. By July 10th, it is 80 miles from Leningrad. In 3 weeks, Army Group Center travels 450 miles, and it encircles, you can see these pockets here, around Minsk and Smolensk. It actually encircles huge contingents of the Red Army, and it destroys them. And the Chief of Staff of this time, the Chief of Staff here is Franz Halder. After Ludwig Beck resigned in 1938, Franz Halder became the Army Chief of Staff. And Franz Halder was very optimistic. He wrote in his diary on 3 March, quote, on the whole, one can say that the task of smashing the mass of the Russian army has been fulfilled. It is probably not too much to say when I assert that the campaign against Russia has been won within 2 weeks. The campaign in Russia has been won within 2 weeks. Now, one thing that's happening as the Wehrmacht is advancing into Russia, of course, because it's so successful, it's going to be taking hundreds of thousands of POWs. hundreds of thousands of POWs. For instance, around Kiev, when the German army gets to Kiev, what they're doing is, when the German army is it's advancing, it's getting around. They're going around groups, right? They're not the armored Panzer Divisions. They're not just hitting straight at the Russians. They're trying to get around them, and they're creating these pockets. So as the German army goes forward, you get these pockets of surrounded Red Army units. It's creating these pockets. In the Kiev pocket alone, there's 220,000 prisoners that are taken. 220,000 prisoners that are taken. Now, the prisoners, the Wehrmacht, as I mentioned before, as it invades the Soviet Union, really good at operations, not so good at things like intelligence and logistics. And part of that is they're really not prepared to take the numbers of prisoners they are taking. So these Soviet prisoners are kept generally in hellish conditions. They're kept in these hellish conditions. Most of their basic needs aren't being met. In some cases, they're not being fed. Again, because remember, the German army, its orders were to live off the land, to take what you need from the countryside, and that's how you're going to eat. Well, that means there's not a lot, to go around. So they're certainly not going to feed prisoners if they don't have to. And again, this kind of logistical shortcoming is kind of meshed with this German racist attitude toward the Slavs, toward the Eastern Europeans, toward the Slavs. Now, there's one German civil servant who happens to be kind of in the front line on an inspection tour, and his name is Xavier Dorsch. I don't think I have him up here. No. Xavier Dorsch. He's a civil servant. He's a civilian. He's a bureaucrat. You know, the army, of course, has needs and stuff, so he's going to the front lines to kind of talk with the army. And he actually kind of wrote about, he saw this Soviet prisoner of war camp near Minsk in July of 1941. And he said, quote, "The prisoners are packed so tightly together in this area that they can hardly move and have to relieve themselves where they stand. They are guarded by a company-sized unit of active soldiers. The small size of the guard unit means that it can only control the camp by using the most brutal level of force. The problem of feeding the prisoners of war is virtually insoluble. Some of them have been without food for 6 to 8 days. They're just being held in horrible conditions here. By the end of 1941, 300,000 Soviet prisoners of war have died. By the end of 1941, 300,000 prisoners of war had died. These were men, and it's predominantly men. The Red Army was going to introduce women a little bit later into combat. So these are predominantly men, and they are killed. These were healthy men in June. By the end of the year, they pretty much starved to death and been horribly mistreated. Now, during the entire war, Germany took a total of 5.7 million Soviets prisoner. Okay, so during the entire war, Germany will take a total of 5.7 million Soviet prisoners. Estimates say as many as 3.3 million of them will die in custody over the course of the war. So out of 5.7 million Soviet prisoners taken in the war, our estimates say about 3.3 million died as German prisoners. That is a death rate of 58%. 58%. Now, by contrast to that, over the course of the war, the Soviets will take about 2 million German prisoners. The Soviets will take about 2 million German prisoners. Those Germans that die in Soviet custody amounted to 356,687. 356,687. That is only an 18% death rate. 18% death rate. So you're far more likely to die if you're a Soviet prisoner of the Germans than if you're a German prisoner of the Soviets in the course of the war. The invasion of the Soviet Union is also marked with just massive, massive atrocities and murders and massacres. This is not a war of just army versus army, and there's some collateral damage with civilians. Civilians are targeted in this war. Civilians are targeted in this war. Now, our next unit, we're really going to get into the Holocaust, okay? And we'll discuss this in detail. Specifically, behind the German lines, behind the German army, we're going to have Einsatzgruppen behind the army. We know the Einsatzgruppen, the special action groups. We'll be having Einsatzgruppen that will target Jews and communists. And we'll get much more into that in our next unit in the Holocaust. But even beyond that, as I say, the German army is committing all sorts of atrocities. Now, the popular idea about the German army in World War II and what happened in Russia was for a very long time, it was the SS, the Einsatzgruppen, these fanatical Nazi types, they were doing all the killing in Russia, and the German army was acting honorably. They were an honorable force. They were fighting just the way armies fight. And in fact, that's just not the case. The German army itself was involved in these murders and massacres. When Erich von Manstein is tried at Nuremberg, he says, well, I was always arguing with the SS. You can ask my people. I was always arguing with the SS about stuff. Well, he wasn't arguing with the SS about kind of the moral or philosophical ideas of killing civilians. Rather, he was arguing because he would loan the SS military units that would often commit atrocities under the SS, and he just wanted them back for his operations. So the German army is, like I say, it's up to their eyeballs in blood. When I was at the University of Utah working on my bachelor's and my master's degree, I worked under a professor named Dr. Ron Smelser, and he and another professor, Ed Davies, who I also took some classes from. They wrote a book that came out in 2008 called The Myth of the Eastern Front. And they do a very good job. And really, it's called The Myth of the Eastern Front, the Nazi-Soviet War, and American Popular Culture. And they actually talk about this and about how you get war gamers, you get reenactors who kind of buy into this idea that the German army acted honorably. It didn't. Now, which is not to say there weren't individual good people in the German army. Of course there were. But the army as an institution was thoroughly corrupted. It was thoroughly radicalized by the Nazis, and it was committing these kinds of atrocities. Incidentally, so this is some Soviets in railway cars, prisoners that are being taken from the front. This is Heinrich Himmler here, the head of the SS. He's visiting a Soviet prisoner of war camp, and what he's doing is he's looking at some of these prisoners to see if any of them have blonde hair, blue eyes, if they can be Aryanized, meaning maybe we can take them and use them in our army or use them to good effect in Germany. And he'll do that. There was actually one instance where Himmler was at the front and they were doing this, and he actually went up to this guy he spoke Russian, so he had to speak through a translator, who had blonde hair and blue eyes. He looked German, but by Nazi standards, he looked German, but he was a Russian. And he had said, "Do you have any German ancestry?" And he says, "I don't." He says, "You don't even have like a great grandfather or something that was German?" He says, "No, as far as I know, I'm all Russian." And Himmler asked this guy like 3 or 4 times, "Are you sure you don't have any German ancestry?" And the guy kept saying, "No, as far as I know, I'm Russian." He said, "Okay, I can't do anything for you." So they ended up shooting all these guys. And so that's kind of pretty typical of the way Himmler thinks. Rape is never an official policy of the Wehrmacht. It's never an official policy of the Wehrmacht. And one of the reasons is because it's kind of one of those things that's sexual relations between a German and a Slav. It kind of potentially crosses the Nazi racial laws. Because it was a crime for a German to have sex with a Jew by this point. Okay? And a Slav is really crossing the line here. And again, it's pretty arbitrary where that line is. But nevertheless, despite the fact that rape is officially illegal, you see tremendous amounts of rape on the Eastern Front. Tremendous amounts of rape of Soviet women by the Germans on the Eastern Front. As we will see toward the end of the war, when the Soviets come into Germany, then the reverse happens. But rape is rape can be a very powerful weapon in war, because rape, obviously, aside from the horror of the physical act of rape, on a kind of a psychological level, rape is a way of challenging a nation's power to defend itself. You can't even defend your women, which is a very... It goes to something in man, this kind of idea of, today you might call it toxic masculinity or something, but there's a real sense that men have of protecting their women. And that's, again, on a broad level. I'm not trying to take anything away from the actual horror of the actual event there. But rape is very, very common in this war on the Eastern Front. Now, despite the initial success in Russia, the Germans keep thinking, once they destroy like this big army group around Kiev or one around Minsk, they're thinking, that's the bulk of the Russian army. They're not going to have anything else to send against us, right? They keep thinking, we just won. All that's left is some mopping up actions to do that summer. But by August, they're kind of surprised because they destroy these big army formations, and yet more keep coming. Halder wrote in his diary on August 2nd, "In the situation as a whole, it is becoming clearer that we have underestimated the Russian colossus. At the outset of the war, we reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now we are already counting 360. These divisions are certainly not armed and equipped in our sense of the words, and tactically they are often poorly led. But there they are. And when a dozen of them have been destroyed, then the Russians put up another dozen." So even though they keep destroying these formations, Russia has such a wealth of manpower that it keeps drawing on these reserves that it can throw at the Germans. Well, what was it Stalin said? Quantity is its own quality. And that's what he's talking about. If you just keep throwing numbers. Because remember, the Russians, they can win the war just by not losing it at this point, right? So that's what they're doing. They're just throwing men into this furnace here. Well, what happens is, by August, something very important happens. And this is why I'm kind of dismissive. We talked about how Hitler goes into the Balkans, and that cost him a few weeks. And a lot of people said, well, if only Hitler had invaded Russia in May, he would have won the war. And this is why I kind of don't think that's true. In August, the Wehrmacht essentially stops. It doesn't. Now it's bringing up supplies. It's kind of refitting itself, but it still has some initiative. It didn't really have to stop, except for the fact that they didn't really know what to do. They were far more successful initially than they had hoped, and they don't really know what to do from here. And we start to see a big debate happen between Hitler and his generals. Okay, a big debate happens between Hitler and his generals. His generals... do I have a map up here? No. His generals want to go to Moscow. His generals say, we need to go to Moscow. Now, Moscow is, of course, the capital of the Soviet Union, and traditionally in European history, if you captured the enemy's capital, that's kind of game, set, and match. The great contrary point to that is, the great exception to that was when Napoleon invaded Moscow, right? Didn't work out too well for Napoleon. And Hitler is influenced by what happened to Napoleon, right? Because what happened to Napoleon when he got to Moscow? Because he captures Moscow. They burn their own city down, and Napoleon's army is just kind of not in a good way, and it's got to retreat, right? So Hitler's kind of afraid of what happened to Napoleon here. But not only is Moscow a symbolic prize for the Wehrmacht. It has real military applications here. It is, first of all, the major nexus of the Soviet railroad and communication lines. So transportation and communications throughout the country go through Moscow. So if you take Moscow, you're essentially cutting the Wehrmacht or the Red Army's ability to kind of move north-south and even a little bit east-west throughout the country. So that would be, there's a big, a legitimate reason to try to take Moscow. Hitler, on the other hand, he wants to go for the flanks. Hitler wants to take Leningrad in the north. He wants to take Leningrad north, which is under siege. The entire length of the siege will be like 999 days. Okay, so Leningrad is under siege. The Finns are coming in from the north to help out. He thinks at this time he wants to take Leningrad north, and then he wants to take the Caucasus Mountains in the south. The Caucasus, right? The Caucasus are where a lot of Soviet oil reserves are. Okay. So he's thinking we take the flanks. Hitler is thinking kind of long term here. He's thinking a lot of people that dismiss Hitler as an armchair general and he's a horrible general kind of miss the point that something very fundamentally important happened in the Weimar period with the army. And that is the army kind of loses its ability to produce great strategic thinkers. And you could even argue, it was even before Weimar, you could argue that Ludendorff was not a great strategic thinker. I think that you could make that argument. In fact, Ludendorff was always thinking in terms of the next battle, the next campaign, but he's not necessarily thinking about how do we win the war, right? Hitler, by contrast, he's always kind of thinking ahead, more so than his generals at this point. In fact, early in the war, I think you can make a case that Hitler was actually a very good strategist early in the war. For instance, Heinz Guderian, when they invade France in 1940, he gives a report to Hitler. He says, we're going to take this city, then we're going to take this city, we got a clear road to this city. And Hitler's all, and then what? I mean, that's great, but how do we translate this into military victory? Operational successes into ultimate victory. How do we do that? And the generals are kind of thinking in that terms of the next battle, the next campaign. Hitler's thinking, how do we win the war? And here, Hitler's thinking in terms of resources. If we can take that oil from the Russians and conversely deny it to them, if we control the Ukraine with all of its food and we deny it to them, I mean, this is how you fight a modern war. This is how you. So I think now Hitler's, if we could call it strategic senses, they will depart him. Toward the end of the war, his entire strategy is based on wishful thinking, and that's kind of what people think about when they dismiss Hitler. But here in the early part of the war, Hitler's actually a pretty decent strategist. For pretty much the month of August, the Wehrmacht doesn't do much. This does allow it to get resupplied and what have you. But finally, they kind of reach some compromises. Hitler says, let's kind of drive further in Ukraine, but okay, I'll attach some units to a drive in the center toward Moscow. And so the Wehrmacht launches this kind of, and let me point out too, the Wehrmacht is not strong enough to do everything. Its resources are limited. And the thing about Europe is, if you look at, okay, so here's my crude drawing of Europe. All right. Okay, so here's Moscow. Now you'll notice the thing about Europe is, and Chris Bellamy makes this point in his book, Absolute War. Europe is like a cone. Okay, you see that? It's like a cone. So the further east you go, the more you have to spread yourself out. Whereas the further west you go, the lines become shorter, right? So essentially, with your limited resources, the further east you push, the more successful you are, the more you have to cover. Okay? And this is kind of what we're talking about here. They go ahead and they launch in October Operation Typhoon. Operation Typhoon. And this is intended to be the push on Moscow. The push on Moscow. By this point, the Germans can only muster about 1,000 aircraft. They've only got about 1,000 aircraft for this operation. And they get, again, some initial success. Some initial success. In fact, advanced reconnaissance units get within about 15 miles of the city. Get within about 15 miles of Moscow. So close that they could actually see St. Basil's Cathedral in the distance. The big cathedral in Moscow. They can see St. Basil's in the distance here. But the Russians, because the Germans are so stretched out, so weak because they got to cover so much, they can't really concentrate enough power in one area like they need to. And the Russians are pretty much focusing everything they can on holding Moscow. And in fact, Stalin had learned from Richard Sorge, the German spy he had in Japan, he had learned the Japanese had no intentions of attacking Port Arthur and Vladivostok on the east. So Stalin pulls a lot of his troops out of Siberia and brings them to help defend Moscow. But the Wehrmacht just can't take it. It just doesn't have the strength. It's almost, but it's not quite. It just doesn't quite take it. This is the first time in the war that an enemy army has stopped the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht has beaten every army it's gone up against in continental Europe. It was stopped in the west against England only by geography, only by the English Channel. But here, an enemy army is able to stop the Wehrmacht. The very first time the Wehrmacht is stopped. In early December, the Soviets launch a counterattack. They launch a counterattack. Now, Hitler orders all of his armies, do not retreat. Hold your ground. Now, Hitler's going to keep doing this throughout the war, and it's going to have disastrous consequences later. Right here, it was probably, from a military point of view, the correct thing to do. Because the army, stretched as thin as it was, as demoralized as it was, could have crumbled. If they had started retreating, it could have turned into a rout. So by telling his guys to hold where they are, they probably prevented the German army from just being destroyed right there in 1941. So the Battle of Moscow will last roughly from October of 41 to January of 42. There's no real set time where it ends. I mean, they keep fighting around this area until really April or so. But the main operations last from October to January. And you have about 175,000 German casualties. 175,000 German casualties. Soviets will have a lot more. I don't have it right in front of me, but it's a lot more. So this happens about the second... This counterattack happens toward the end of the first, beginning of the second week of December of 1941. Now let me ask you all a question. Can you think of anything else important that happened about that same time? Pearl Harbor. Okay? That is incredibly significant. In fact, some people will say, and I think there's something to this, the Axis lost World War II this week. Right? The first part of December is where the Axis lost the war. Because they were stopped in Russia, and then Pearl Harbor happens. Now, Pearl Harbor is going to have incredibly significant impact, of course, on the war in the long term and in the short term. Now, here's the thing. Japan attacks the United States on December 7th, 1941. On December 8th, the United States declares war on Japan. Now, here's the thing. Germany and Italy had no treaty obligations whatsoever to join a war against the United States. They had no treaty obligations whatsoever to declare war on the United States. There wasn't even really an expectation of that. With the treaties with Japan, there wasn't even really an expectation of that. Now, since early 1941, the United States have been sending Lend-Lease aid to England. And then after the Germans invaded the Soviets, the United States began sending Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets. These are raw materials, this is food, this is weapons, guns, tanks, aluminum, aircraft, all sorts of things, right, to fight this war. As the war goes on, increasingly, Franklin Roosevelt had extended this line by which those ships carrying Lend-Lease aid to Britain, he keeps extending how far they're protected, meaning how far American destroyers will follow them to protect them before British destroyers protect them. Well, some would suggest Roosevelt was actually trying to get the Germans to attack American ships so that we could get in on the war. Some people would say, no, Roosevelt didn't want war. I actually think he knew war was coming and we'd have to get in it sooner or later. But, so he creates this system, or rather Hitler sees this system that the Americans have created, where they're kind of damned if they do, if they damned if they don't. They've got these U-boats. If they start attacking American warships, he's going to go to war with America. But on the other hand, if he doesn't attack those ships, then England and Russia get those supplies that they need, right, that will fight their guys on land. So Hitler's kind of damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. Well, when America is attacked by Japan, suddenly a light bulb goes off with Hitler, and he says, you know what? The Americans are going to be so busy with their navy against Japan, now is the time for me to start attacking American Lend-Lease shipping and attacking those warships, protecting the shipping. So on December 11th, 1941, again without any treaty obligation to do so, Adolf Hitler declares war on the United States. Germany declares war on the United States, and Italy declares war on the United States shortly thereafter. Now Hitler's U-boats are free to shoot whoever they want to shoot. They're free to try to sink as much of that Lend-Lease stuff as they can. Critically, one of the things they're going to do, one of America's great failures in this war is we have all this oil in Texas, but we need to get to the East Coast. We didn't have a pipeline. We actually built a pipeline during the war. So we would ship oil from Texas to the United States East Coast. Well, as soon as we do that, as soon as Hitler declares war, he immediately sends his U-boats to take out all that oil that's being shipped from the Gulf of Mexico to the West Coast. And he has amazing success. It was a huge embarrassment to the United States Navy right at the beginning of the war. Well, and Hitler, too, he kind of had a lot of faith in Japan. You know, he said, Japan, we're now allied with a country that has not been defeated in 1,000 years or something like that. So Hitler kind of sees the Japanese as being almost a surrogate German Navy, right? The Japanese Navy would almost act as a German surrogate in drawing away American power. He really believes America's going to just concentrate on Japan. America's just going to fight Japan. And in a way, he thinks Japan has neutralized the United States, so it doesn't matter if he goes to war with them or not. But really, fundamentally, what happens at this point, with the entry of the United States into World War II, we see two kind of regional conflicts, right? The Japanese have been fighting the Chinese for several years by this point, Second Sino-Japanese War. So there's already this war in Asia. And then, of course, we've been having the war in Europe going for 2 years. And with the entry of the United States, which has common enemies in both theaters, enemies and allies in both theaters, that's when it truly becomes a world war. It truly becomes a world war. In fact, John Lukács, a great historian, he wrote a book called The Last European War. And he calls it The Last European War because he covers World War II from the outbreak of the invasion of Poland in 1939 until the entry of the United States into the war. Because there he says it's just the European war until that point. So Germany and Japan had a treaty prior to Pearl Harbor. And it was an anti-communist treaty. Hitler did not expect, nor did not want the Japanese to attack the Soviet Union when he went into the Soviet Union. He thought he didn't need their help. As the war goes on, he then starts to try to convince the Japanese to do this. They were, on paper, allies. They theoretically had common goals, but they never really worked together the way the Allies did. The Allies really planned strategy. In fact, at the end of the month, in December 1941, Churchill goes, he spends Christmas in Washington, and what you have happen between the Allies is the American Chiefs of Staff and the British Chiefs of Staff, they create an entirely new body called the Combined Chiefs of Staff. So Britain and America, literally, their militaries are integrated at the highest level. They're working completely together at the highest level. You never see anything like that happen between Germany and Japan, or even Germany and Italy. And nothing like that happens on the Axis side. That is one of the key reasons why we win the war. Now, Hitler is pretty mad at the army for not taking Moscow. He's pretty mad at the army. So Hitler does what he always does. He fires his commander-in-chief of the army. His commander-in-chief of the army, Walter von Brauchitsch. Now remember, von Brauchitsch had been the commander-in-chief of the army since when? Do you remember when he becomes commander-in-chief of the army? Werner von Fritsch.
Yeah.
Werner von Fritsch, right? And you remember how was he ousted? How was he fired? Remember? Yeah, right. Remember, they thought he was a homosexual. They thought he was gay, so they fire him. And it turns out he wasn't. It was a case of mistaken identity. But they fire him, and then he ends up getting killed in Poland. And so von Brauchitsch then becomes the commander-in-chief of the army. But now, Hitler gets rid of von Brauchitsch. And so here's what Hitler does. Instead of replacing von Brauchitsch with the new commander-in-chief of the army, he becomes the commander-in-chief of the army, which means you have Hitler as the chancellor and president, the Führer, right? The Führer is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. All of the armed forces, he's the ultimate body there. But right below that, he is also the war minister, who is supposedly a civilian position to deal with that, and he creates the OKW, Over Commander de Wehrmacht, to help him with that, but he's the war minister. And now, he is the CNC of the army. So he keeps inserting himself further and further down. And then, the following year, briefly, he will actually, too, command an army group in Russia from Germany. So what we see here is Hitler increasingly micromanages this war. Eventually they'll tell him this isn't working and he'll agree to give that up, but he keeps all of these other offices. You need levels, you need vertical command. You need somebody to tell you when your idea is not a good idea. And no one is doing this because he's taking these offices, increasingly taking these offices that give him that power there. Any questions about that? Okay. The lines stabilize in early 1942. The Russians make some more counterattacks. Germans generally are able to fight them. One thing happens very interesting, though, here in the spring of 1942. You've got this guy here, Fritz Todt. Fritz Todt had created, Hitler allowed him to create an organization early in the war called the Organization Todt. The Organization Todt, a lot of these guys would wear, on their Nazi armbands, they'd have like a little banner above it that said OT, for Organization Todt. They were essentially civil engineers. Okay? They were essentially civil engineers. The Organization Todt, they would build roads, bridges, but they are not army. Okay, these are civilians that are building, like I say, roads, bridges. They're repairing railway lines because there's so much work the army has to do. They're bringing in this Organization Todt to help get the stuff taken care of in Russia. Well, what happens is one day, Hitler is in Ukraine, at an army headquarters in Ukraine. And he's having meetings, and he has a meeting with Todt. He calls Todt to come to meet him. Just so happens Albert Speer, his architect, who was also doing some civilian engineering stuff for the army this time, he flies into this there might have been in Rastenburg, kind of thing, but it might have been in East Prussia when this happened. I can't remember where they were. They're in the east. Anyway, so Speer happens to be there, and before Todt goes in to see Hitler, because Hitler's going to meet with him individually, Todt says to Speer, "I'm heading back to Berlin tomorrow morning. Do you want to join me on my plane?" Speer says, "Yeah, I'll join you on your plane tomorrow." Well, Todt goes in, meets with Hitler, and Todt is one of the few guys that kind of tells Hitler the truth. This isn't working, this isn't working, this isn't doing good. And Hitler's getting mad with this guy. He's getting frustrated with this guy. Well, anyway, the next morning, an adjutant knocks on Speer's door and says, well, Speer goes in, has a meeting with Hitler, and Hitler loved to talk to Speer. Speer remembers like his friend. And they're talking about all the things they're going to build after the war's over. So they're going all into the night talking about all this crap. The next morning, Speer was up all night talking to Hitler. The next morning, one of these adjutants knocks on Speer's door and says, "Hey, are you ready to go? Minister Todt's ready to fly out." And Speer says, I'm just too tired. I'm just going to sleep in. Will you tell Minister Todt I won't join you? He says, "Yeah, I'll tell him." A few hours later, the plane takes off, and it crashes. Everybody on board, including Mr. Todt, is killed. Speer survived. He wasn't on the plane. So Hitler, of course, he's upset, and he orders an investigation. But on the spot, almost immediately after they receive word that Todt is dead, I don't have it there, but almost immediately, Hitler turns to Speer and he says, "You are the new leader of Organization Todt. You are the new leader." And this happened, there's no consideration, there's no deliberation, there's no committee to pick a new leader. Hitler just arbitrarily says, "You're the new leader of Organization Todt." So now Speer has his new brief. And essentially, through Organization Todt, which also dealt a lot with munitions, and the brief will expand, Speer will eventually become the Minister of Munitions. Armament and War Production is his title. Minister of Armament and War Production. So Albert Speer will now become incredibly powerful. He'll essentially become the leader of the German economy, war economy. Okay? So he'll be very powerful here. But there are questions. Why did this plane go down? Very quickly, after that plane went down, Hermann Goering showed up at this headquarters to say, "I'd be more than happy to take over Organization Todt," right? Because again, they're always trying to empire build here. They're always trying to empire build. And, of course, Hitler says, "Oh, I've already made Speer head of Organization Todt." Gordon wasn't too happy about it. So a lot of people have speculated over the years, did Hitler have this guy killed because he spoke up to him? That seems a little out of character. An assassination like this, to me, it doesn't seem something like Hitler would do. Hitler would probably just fire the guy, maybe throw him in a camp or something. Probably just fire him. But I don't know. It just doesn't feel like Hitler's style. Did Goering put this bomb in there? Was there a bomb? Did Hitler somehow cause a mechanical malfunction in this plane? He was the head of the Luftwaffe. The guy servicing the plane worked for him. And then he just shows up to take over that stuff. Did he plan this? Did Speer plan this? I doubt it. Speer, it really doesn't strike me something Speer would do. But who knows? Or was it just mechanical failure, which is what they ruled? Right? One of those kind of interesting little mysteries from the Third Reich. Well, by the spring, we're preparing to launch a new offensive. Stalin is convinced they're going to come back to Moscow. He's convinced the Germans are going to come back to Moscow. But again, Hitler said, no, we're going after the Caucasus Mountains. Caucasus Mountains down here to get that oil. In order to get that oil, we've got to go through the rest of Ukraine, and they call this Operation Case Blue. So in the summer of 1941, we had Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and now in the summer of 1942, we have a smaller operation called Operation Case Blue. Whereas Barbarossa was intended to, boom, knock Russia out of the war, this operation is intended to take those resources, that oil, deny it to the Soviets, and put them in a better position to take out the rest of the Soviet Union. So Case Blue begins in August of 1942. German morale is relatively high. They know they're weaker than they were a year ago, but so are the Soviets, was the thinking. And again, this gains initial success. Initially, they begin to get a lot of success. They actually start to move units down into the Caucasus Mountains, take the Caucasus Mountains there. But in order to shore up their left, they need to take Stalingrad. They need to take the city of Stalingrad. So the Germans, they reach the outskirts of Stalingrad by August of 1942. They reach the outskirts of Stalingrad by August of 1942. The Battle of Stalingrad then will begin in August, and the army that is charged with taking the city is the Sixth Army, the German Sixth Army. German Sixth Army. German Sixth Army is under command of a general named Friedrich Paulus, who had been a staff officer, and he didn't have a lot of success, or pardon me, he didn't have a lot of experience leading an army himself. So they actually push here into Stalingrad. Initially, the Sixth Army has about 300,000 men. They go into Stalingrad with about 300,000 men. They have 500 tanks, 600 aircraft, and about 3,000 heavy guns, artillery. But here's the thing. Even as the Sixth Army is going into the city, you've got to have units protecting your flanks, the north and the south flank. If all of our German units, which are the best units arguably on earth at this time, if they're all concentrated trying to take the city, we have to put lesser units on the flanks to hold the flanks. And who do they have to hold the flanks? They're allies. The Romanians, the Italians, they're not that good. They're not that good, and they're holding the flanks. So you can see as they invest the city, as they move into the city there, up here, down here, you've got the these inferior Italians, Hungarians, Romanians. They succeed in taking most of the city. They take most of the city. In fact, you can see they get to the river, the Volga River in some areas. They take most of the city. And if you saw the David Thompson thing we had earlier this year, this is while he was talking about, right? But what happens is, as they get into the city, do I have it? No, I don't have it. As they get into the city, they meet the Soviet 62nd Army, which is staying in the city. And it's not, the commander, his name is Chukov, he said, was it grab him by the belt and punch him in the face or something like that? Fight close, fight dirty. And this is just a horrible battle. The Germans, when they go in, they have to fight street by street. If they go into a building, they literally would have to go room by room to clear it out, and then floor by floor to make sure there were no Soviets in there. Soviets are putting booby traps in there. You know, it's really nasty fighting. It's really hard fighting, and it's really wearing on the Germans. Again, the Wehrmacht was designed for these very fast maneuvers. And what it's doing in Stalingrad looks like what happened in World War I. You know, it's just a meat grinder. It's just a meat grinder there. The Soviets, Stalin wanted just to throw everything and hit these guys back, but Zhukov, his great general Zhukov, he actually said, no, we need to feed just as much into Stalingrad to keep it alive. Just feed just as much into Stalingrad to keep our foothold across the river. Meanwhile, they're building up Red Army units here in the north and the south because they know they've got those inferior units holding their flanks. So in November, middle of November, they launch Operation Uranus. Operation Uranus. And Operation Uranus was a gigantic pincer movement from the north and the south. Pincer meaning we surround, right? We're surrounding. We're pinching them off. We're surrounding. So Operation Uranus essentially now traps the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. So where the Germans had been the besiegers, now they are the besieged. So there's this little island in the city of Stalingrad that is held by the Germans. The Russians control the area all around it. Okay? Does everybody understand that? Well, now they've got their own pocket, and they've got to try to find a way to relieve this pocket. Hermann Goering says, oh, the Luftwaffe can do it. We can fly planes in there. We can supply the Sixth Army. We can do this. They can't do it. The Germans just don't have enough planes. Just the tremendous, tremendous needs of this army. They're just absolutely overwhelmed with how much they have to consume, and they can't fly it all into the city. They can't fly it all into the city. And not only that, the Soviets can shoot down these big lumbering cargo planes quite easily with their own aircraft. It's going to be funny because the Soviets think because of their experience in Stalingrad, they'll be able to defeat the Allied airlift into West Berlin in 1949 during the Berlin crisis. The German Air Force was nothing compared to the United States Air Force in 1949. And the Soviets can't do it then. But anyway, here, Hermann Goering promises to keep it supplied by air, and he fails. It fails. He can't do it. Next, he gets Erich von Manstein. Erich von Manstein, again, we talked about, great general. Now he's a field marshal. He is a field marshal. He took Sevastopol. After he took Sevastopol to make him a field marshal. And he essentially cobbles together a group of units to drive into the city, to try to break the ring. And it fails. The Soviets are too strong. He cannot drive into that. So this German pocket keeps shrinking. It keeps shrinking as the Soviets close in. Hitler compares the defense of Stalingrad to what the defenders at Thermopylae did, the Spartans at Thermopylae in 2,400 years earlier. He kind of compares them to that. On December 20th, one soldier wrote to his wife, "We're squatting here with 15 men in a bunker, a hole in the ground roughly the size of a kitchen in Wilderhausen," his home in Germany. "Everyone, you can well picture for yourself this terrible overcrowding. Now the following picture. One man is washing himself, insofar as water is available. A second is delousing himself. A third is eating. A fourth is cooking a fry soup. Another is asleep, etc. That's roughly the milieu here. Food shortages become a major, major issue. The Sixth Army runs out of food." Another soldier wrote home, he said, "We're mainly feeding ourselves with horse meat, and I myself have eaten raw horse meat because I was so hungry." Another soldier wrote, "I am exhausted. I cannot sleep at night, but dream with open eyes, again and again, of cakes, cakes, cakes. Sometimes I pray, and sometimes I curse my fate. In any case, everything has no meaning or no point." Another soldier wrote, "I weigh only 92 pounds, nothing more than skin and bones, the living dead." These soldiers are just running out of that. And not only are they running out of food, it is freezing. It is freezing. You're cold and you're starving. Do you know what that does? It makes you not care. These guys literally just gradually forget their training and they don't care. They're walking around in plain sight. Soviets pick them off left and right. Anthony Beevor, in his book on Stalingrad, which is great, he talks about this. He talks about the apathy that begins to set in among the common soldiers. If you're not eating and you're freezing, death doesn't seem too bad, you know? I read some accounts that said some people would actually try to go to the bathroom, have a bowel movement, and as they're doing it, it would freeze inside them. They would literally, a lot of times, they would have to light fires under their tanks to heat the oil so that it wasn't congealed and frozen, so that it would move, right? I mean, it's just horrible conditions here. Franz Halder was fired by Hitler because Stalingrad wasn't going so well. Franz Halder is fired, and he's replaced with this guy, Kurt Zeitzler. And Kurt Zeitzler, he decided he was going to put himself on the exact same rations that the average soldier had in Stalingrad. I read one account that said, 6 men had to share a loaf of bread a day, right? And Kurt Zeitzler puts himself on the same rations. And he does this because he wants to show Hitler how bad things are. And apparently he lost just very quickly, he just lost a ton of weight. And he's in headquarters, he's a general, he can eat whatever he wants, right? But he's trying to show Hitler how bad things are getting. And Hitler finally realized how sickly he was, and he ordered him to eat. He said, you have to eat, you can't do this. For Christmas, with his pocket in Stalingrad, these guys starving in Stalingrad, Goebbels, in order to lift up the spirits of the people at home, he creates a radio program that would broadcast from Stalingrad, a choir from Stalingrad, and they'd be singing, hymns, Christmas hymns, to the people back in Germany. And, it was this great thing, live from Stalingrad. We've arranged this radio thing. So all these people around Germany were listening to this heavenly choir of soldiers singing in Stalingrad. The only problem was, of course, it wasn't from Stalingrad. It was from a studio in Berlin. They were just telling people it was from Stalingrad. And of course, these troops are reading scripts saying, we know things are tough, but we know we'll win in the end, and just crap like that. The soldiers in Stalingrad heard this. They picked this up on their radio. And they were very surprised to learn they had a choir, much less anybody who felt like singing. Right? On January 30th, which was the 10th anniversary, 1943, January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Goebbels states on the radio, he says, quote, "The heroic struggle of our soldiers on the Volga should be a warning for everybody to do the utmost for the struggle for Germany's freedom and the future of our people, and thus, in a wider sense, for the maintenance of our entire continent." That same day, January 30th, Hitler promotes Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal. Now, historically, you are only promoted to Field Marshal after a great victory. But Hitler promotes Paulus to Field Marshal. The reason why Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal is no Field Marshal in the history of Germany had ever surrendered. No Field Marshal had ever surrendered. But of course, this army in Stalingrad can't hold out forever. So what is Hitler telling Paulus to do? Saying, you need to commit suicide. It's the honorable thing to do. You need to commit suicide. And Paulus, of course, says, screw that. He surrenders the army. And you see these German soldiers here by this point. Paulus surrenders to the Soviets, and Hitler railed, quote, that Paulus could have freed himself from all sorrow and ascended into eternity and national immortality, but he prefers to go to Moscow. 91,000 men, including 22 generals. 91,000 men, including 22 generals, was all that was left of the 6th Army when it surrenders here on February 2nd. Some estimates say as Germany had poured more and more resources into it, in this battle they lost somewhere between 747,000 and 868,000 men. 747,000 to 868,000 men. That's casualties. Killed, wounded, missing, captured. The Soviets lost perhaps as many as 1.2 million. Soviets lost perhaps 1.2 million. Now, the Battle of Stalingrad is incredibly important because this is the turning point of the war in Europe. This is the turning point of the war in Europe. A few months later, you'll also have the loss of the Africa Corps in North Africa. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And those two blows combined mean that Germany simply cannot recover. Germany, with Stalingrad, loses the strategic initiative of the war. The Soviets haven't really gained it yet, but the Germans lose it. With Stalingrad, the Germans lose the strategic initiative of the war.